At 4:30 p.m. on the 2nd of April 1903, a dark funnel cloud appeared on the western horizon of Monmouth, Illinois. The sky had been heavy all afternoon, a thick stillness hanging over the town of roughly 9,000 people. The air was warm for early spring, but there was a strange green tint to the light. The funnel was not the first sign. For about 20 minutes before it formed, residents near the edge of town heard a sound they had never heard before, a low, steady roar that seemed to come from the ground itself, like a freight train on a track that did not exist. Some looked west and saw the cloud rotating, a slow churning that tightened as it moved eastward. At 4:32 p.m., the tornado touched down just outside the city limits. The first structure it struck was a farmhouse belonging to the Wilson family. Everything seemed normal at 4:30 p.m., only a few minutes later something was off. The tornado was not a thin rope. It was a massive column, black at the base and gray above, stretching from the ground into a low ceiling of clouds. Eyewitnesses later described it as wider than the town itself, though that was likely the distortion of terror. The Weather Bureau office in Chicago had no way to issue warnings. There was no radar, no telephone network connecting meteorological observers to town officials. The only signals were visual. A few farmers had noted the strange sky and the sudden change in wind direction, but by the time they could hitch a horse and ride into Monmouth to warn others, the tornado had already crossed the railroad tracks at the western edge of town. It was at 4:35 p.m. that the funnel reached the first residential blocks on West Broadway. The debris cloud rose instantly. Houses were not simply destroyed, they were erased. Boards, bricks, roofing, tin, furniture, and clothing were pulled into the vortex and hurled eastward at speeds no one then could measure. The tornado was moving northeast at an estimated 40 to 50 miles per hour, which meant it covered the entire length of Monmouth in less than 4 minutes. At 4:36 p.m., it struck the downtown business district. The public square lined with brick buildings 3 and 4 stories tall was the commercial heart of Warren County. The Monmouth Public Library, the courthouse, the opera house, and dozens of stores and offices were in its path. The buildings did not collapse in the normal sense. The walls were sucked outward and then inward, as if the building had been turned inside out. The heavy hand-hewn beams of the courthouse roof were lifted and carried 3 blocks away. The iron safes in several banks were found later, tumbled and dented, half buried in fields east of town. At 4:37 p.m., the tornado reached the residential district north of the square. Here the damage was total. Entire rows of wood frame houses were swept from their foundations. Many homes had no basements. Families had taken shelter under tables or in interior rooms, but the tornado did not discriminate. Bodies were found a quarter-mile away, some stripped of clothing, some impaled by debris that had become projectiles. The death toll began to mount before anyone could count. The exact number of casualties would take days to determine. At 4:38 p.m., the tornado left the Monmouth city limits. It continued northeast for another 8 miles, leveling farms and orchards before it lifted near the village of Little York. The entire event from first touch to final lift lasted approximately 12 minutes. What happened? The tornado that struck Monmouth was later classified as an F4 on the modern Fujita scale, though no such scale existed in 1903. Its path length was about 12 miles, its maximum width at least half a mile. The destruction was concentrated in a swath that cut directly through the most densely populated parts of town. The official death toll settled at 89 people, though at least 2 more died from injuries in the following weeks. More than 300 were injured. Over 500 buildings were damaged or destroyed. Property losses were estimated at $1 million at the time, a staggering sum equivalent to roughly $30 million today. The people of Monmouth were not unprepared for bad. They knew the signs of thunderstorms. Many had experienced heavy windstorms before. But a tornado of this intensity was beyond the experience of nearly everyone living in central Illinois in 1903. The region had been settled for about 70 years, and while there had been occasional damaging storms, nothing approached the scale of what hit that afternoon. The storm was later characterized as a supercell forming along a dry line, though that terminology would not be used for decades. The Weather Bureau's official report, compiled from eyewitness accounts and damage surveys, noted that the tornado was preceded by heavy hail and a sudden drop in temperature. The hailstones were described as the size of hen's eggs, and they fell for about 10 minutes before the funnel arrived. Some residents later said that the hail was the only warning they had, but it did not tell them where to go or what to expect. The investigators who arrived in Monmouth the next day were agents of the Weather Bureau's Climate and Crop Service, a division that primarily tracked weather for agricultural purposes. Their tools were limited. They carried barometers, thermometers, and measuring tape. They could estimate wind speeds by observing damage patterns. The Beaufort scale was in use, but it only went up to hurricane force. For a tornado, they had no standard. They interviewed survivors, measured debris scatter, and produced maps of the damage path. They noted that trees were twisted and debarked, that railroad rails were bent, that a heavy iron bridge over a creek was lifted and thrown sideways. In one field, a horse was found alive but pinned under a wagon that had been wrapped around a tree. The investigators did not use the word tornado in their initial reports. They called it a cyclone, which was the common term at the time for any violent rotary storm. Who was involved? Almost everyone in Monmouth. The town was small enough that nearly every family knew someone who was killed or injured. The dead included prominent businessmen, farmers who had come to town for supplies, children walking home from school, and elderly residents who could not move quickly enough. The storm struck at 4:30 p.m., a time when many people were still at work in stores and factories, and children were returning from the afternoon session at school. The Monmouth Public School building was hit directly. The roof collapsed, killing several students and teachers. The principal, Charles Fairchild, was among those who died after being caught in the open while trying to help children evacuate. The opera house where a matinee performance had just ended was demolished. The audience had been mostly women and children. Many did not make it out. The response was immediate but chaotic. Without telephones, communication depended on messengers on horseback and runners. The first rescuers were neighbors who dug through rubble with their bare hands. By dusk, trains had arrived from nearby towns, Galesburg, Burlington, Rock Island, bringing doctors, nurses, and extra supplies. The Red Cross, still a relatively young organization, sent a relief team led by Clara Barton herself, who arrived within 2 days. She set up a temporary hospital in a surviving church and coordinated the distribution of food, clothing, and medical aid. Her presence drew national attention to the disaster. What systems failed? In the broadest sense, the entire warning system failed because it did not exist. There was no network for detecting tornadoes. The Weather Bureau's telegraphic reports from local observers were sporadic and slow. Even if a warning had been issued, there was no way to broadcast it to the public. The first commercial radio station would not begin broadcasting until 1920. Newspapers could print a story the next day, but that was useless for a storm that lasted 12 minutes. People relied on their own senses and judgment was often wrong. Many saw the funnel and thought it was a distant cloud. Others thought the roar was a passing train. Those who recognized the danger had no place to go. Basements existed in only a few buildings. The town had no public storm shelters. The best advice, go to the southwest corner of a building, was not widely known. There was no organized emergency response plan. The town's fire department, police force, and city council were all overwhelmed. The event still matters. The Monmouth tornado of 1903 is a case study in the stark vulnerability of 19th-century American towns to extreme weather. It helped spur calls for better meteorological observation and for the establishment of a more robust warning system. In the decades that followed, the Weather Bureau expanded its network of volunteer observers and began experimenting with forecasting techniques that could identify tornado conditions. But those improvements took years, and many more deadly tornadoes would strike before any real progress was made. The Monmouth disaster also highlighted the need for better building practices, though the lessons were learned slowly. Brick buildings that had been thought to be safe were shown to be deadly when roofs collapsed and walls fell outward. The reconstruction of Monmouth used more reinforced construction, but tornadoes remained a threat. The question that lingers is not just what failed, but what could have been done with the knowledge available at the time. The answer is not much. The tornado was a random act of nature that struck a community with no defense. The same vulnerability exists today in many parts of the country, even with modern radar and cell phone alerts. The difference is that now, when the warning comes, there is a chance to act. In 1903, the warning came only when the funnel cloud was visible, and by then it was too late. The people of Monmouth had 12 minutes from the first sighting to the end of the storm. In those 12 minutes, 89 people died, hundreds were injured, and the town was changed forever. In the days that followed the Monmouth tornado, the scale of the loss became fully visible. The streets were piled with debris, splintered lumber, torn metal, shattered glass, and household items scattered in every direction. The smell of wet wood, coal gas, and earthy dampness hung over the town. Bodies were recovered from the wreckage over the next 72 hours. Some were found under collapsed walls. Others had been carried hundreds of feet from where they had been standing. The dead were laid out in a temporary morgue set up in the basement of a surviving church. The injured filled every available bed in the town's 2 small hospitals and the makeshift clinic established by the Red Cross. Families searched for missing relatives, checking lists that were updated hourly by volunteers. By the 3rd day, the recovery effort had shifted from rescue to cleanup. The railroad companies sent work crews to clear the tracks. The telegraph lines were restored within a week. The town's water supply, which had been compromised by broken mains, was brought back online by the end of the first month. But the emotional recovery took much longer. The tornado had killed nearly 1 in every 100 residents of Monmouth at the time, and the dead included entire families. In some blocks, every home was destroyed. The small community of African American residents who lived primarily in the southern part of town lost several of their own. The storm made no distinction by class, race, or age. Clara Barton and her Red Cross team stayed for 6 weeks. They distributed over $30,000 in aid, a significant sum in 1903 including food, clothing, building materials, and cash for immediate needs. Barton herself walked through the ruins, talking to survivors, recording their stories, and writing reports that would later be used to advocate for better disaster preparedness. She was 71 years old at the time, and this was one of her last major relief operations. The Monmouth tornado cemented the Red Cross's role as the primary disaster relief organization in the United States, a role that would expand greatly in the decades to come. The state of Illinois also responded. Governor Richard Yates Jr. visited Monmouth within a week and pledged state resources for reconstruction. The state legislature later appropriated $50,000 in relief funds, though much of that money was spent slowly and with bureaucratic delays. The federal government provided no direct aid. The precedent for federal disaster relief was still decades away. The town had to rebuild with its own resources, private donations, and the help of neighboring communities. The investigation into the tornado was conducted by the Weather Bureau's local observer, a man named John H. Smith, and a special agent sent from Washington, a meteorologist named Alfred J. Henry. Henry had studied tornadoes across the Midwest and was one of the few scientists in the country who had attempted to classify their intensity. He measured the damage path, collected debris samples, and interviewed witnesses. His final report, published in the Monthly Weather Review in 1904, was one of the most detailed accounts of a tornado ever produced. It included maps, drawings of damaged structures, and a narrative timeline of the storm. Henry noted that the tornado had likely formed around 4:15 p.m. over the Mississippi River near Aquaca, about 20 miles southwest of Monmouth. The storm intensified rapidly as it passed over farmland, then reached maximum intensity as it entered the town. He estimated the wind speeds at the core of the funnel to be over 300 miles per hour, an extraordinary figure for the time. Modern analysis would place the winds in the F4 range, between 207 and 260 miles per hour. Henry also observed that the tornado had a multiple vortex structure, a feature that was not well understood then. He described two distinct funnels that rotated around each other, leaving a pattern of alternating damage that puzzled him. The investigation also uncovered a troubling gap in the warning chain. On the morning of May 20th, the Weather Bureau's office in Chicago had issued a general forecast calling for thunderstorms and possibly severe local storms in northern and central Illinois. But that warning was sent by telegraph to newspapers and railroad stations, not to the general public. In Monmouth, the telegraph operator received the message at about 10 a.m. and posted it on the bulletin board at the depot. Few people saw it. By late afternoon, most had forgotten about it. The storm had developed quickly after a hot, humid morning, and the instability in the atmosphere was extreme. The Weather Bureau had no way to update the forecast in real time. Even if they had, there was no mechanism to reach every farmhouse in town. The business of warnings was further complicated by the lack of a common language. The Weather Bureau did not use the word tornado in its forecasts for decades. They preferred terms like severe thunderstorm or cyclone because they feared that using the word tornado would cause panic. That policy remained in place until 1950 when the first official tornado forecasts were issued. In 1903, the phrase severe local storm was the closest thing to a warning. It was not enough. The human consequences of that failure were measured in the stories of individual survivors. Mary Thompson, a schoolteacher at the Monmouth Public School, was in her classroom with 23 students when the roof collapsed. She was killed instantly. Her body was found next to her desk, still holding a piece of chalk. One of her students, a boy named Walter Green, survived by crawling under his desk. He later said he heard the roar, then felt the building lift off its foundation. When he opened his eyes, he was lying in a field 3 blocks away. He had been carried by the wind. He had a broken arm and severe cuts, but he lived. He went on to become a farmer in Warren County and died in 1978 at the age of 83. He never forgot that afternoon. Another survivor, a merchant named Henry Becker, was in his hardware store when the tornado struck. He saw the wall of his building peel away and the entire contents of his shop, hammers, nails, stoves, barrels of nails, sucked into the air. He ducked behind a heavy counter and watched as the floorboards were ripped up around him. When the storm passed, he was buried under a pile of lumber and scrap metal. He dug himself out and immediately began pulling others from the rubble. He later testified to the Weather Bureau that he had seen the funnel approaching but had not believed it would hit the town. He said, "It looked like a big cloud touching the ground, but I thought it was rain." That disbelief was common. Tornadoes were rare in this part of Illinois. People did not know what they were seeing. The aftermath also saw the emergence of pseudoscientific theories. Some local preachers declared that the tornado was divine punishment for the town's sins. Others claimed that the storm was caused by a passing comet. The Weather Bureau's report carefully avoided such speculation, sticking to factual descriptions. But the public hunger for explanations was strong. Newspapers across the country ran sensationalized accounts, some claiming that the tornado had ripped up a train and thrown it into the river, which was not true. The Monmouth tornado became a national story, one of the most destructive in American history up to that point. In the years that followed, the disaster spurred several important changes. The Weather Bureau began a systematic effort to expand its network of volunteer observers, especially in the Midwest. By 1910, there were more than 5,000 cooperative observers sending daily reports by telegraph. That network would eventually form the backbone of the modern climate and weather data system. The Bureau also began experimenting with the use of kites and balloons to obtain upper-air data, which was critical for understanding the formation of thunderstorms and tornadoes. But progress was slow. The first tornado forecast in the United States would not be issued until 1948 by a team of Air Force meteorologists in Oklahoma. The rebuilding of Monmouth took 3 years. A new high school was constructed on a different site, with a reinforced basement that could function as a storm shelter. The downtown was rebuilt with brick and stone, but many businesses never reopened. The population declined slightly as some families moved away. The town recovered economically, but it was never quite the same. The tornado became a defining event in local history, passed down through generations in oral stories and newspaper clippings. To this day, Monmouth has a tornado siren system that is tested every Saturday at noon. The memory of 1903 is still alive. The questions that remain are not about what happened, we have a clear picture of that afternoon. The questions are about what we have learned and what we still fail to do. The Monmouth tornado occurred at a time when the population of the United States was about 76 million, and the annual death toll from tornadoes averaged about 200. Today, with a population of over 300 million, the average annual death toll from tornadoes is around 70, thanks to better warnings and construction. But those improvements are not evenly distributed. Rural communities, mobile homes, and low-income areas remain disproportionately vulnerable. The same problems that plagued Monmouth, lack of shelters, inadequate warnings, disbelief in the face of danger, exist today in different forms. The storm itself was a natural phenomenon. The forces that created it were the same ones that produced tornadoes every spring in the American Midwest: warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico, cool, dry air from the west, and a powerful jet stream overhead. The conditions on May 20, 1903, were ideal for a supercell thunderstorm. The storm formed along a cold front that had been advancing eastward all day. By 4 p.m., the atmosphere was extremely unstable, with a lifted index of -5, a value that today would trigger a moderate risk for severe weather, but no one measured those parameters then. The first radiosonde observations did not begin until the 1 and 3s rose. The science of meteorology was still in its infancy. In many ways, the Monmouth tornado is a reminder of how far we have come and how much we still depend on luck. The town could have been spared if the storm had moved a mile to the south or north. The difference between a town destroyed and a town untouched was often just a few hundred yards. That randomness is still true today. The tornado outbreak of April 27, 2011, killed more than 300 people in Alabama, Mississippi, and other states, even with modern radar and warnings. The Monmouth tornado was a preview of that vulnerability, a small town caught in the path of a force that no one could stop. The legacy of the disaster also includes the stories of resilience. After the storm, the people of Monmouth held a community meeting in a surviving church. They voted to rebuild, to stay, to not let the tornado drive them away. That decision was not easy. Many had lost everything, but they chose to stay. The town exists today because of that choice. The tornado of 1903 is part of its identity, a scar that healed but never fully disappeared. The annual commemoration on May 20th draws a small crowd to a memorial park where the names of the 89 dead are engraved on a granite stone. The names are read aloud one by one and a bell is tolled for each. In the years since, other tornadoes have struck Illinois in 1917, 1925, 1967, 1990, 2013, and 2021. Some were deadlier, some were not. But the Monmouth tornado remains significant because it happened at a turning point. It was one of the first tornado disasters to be systematically studied and documented by the Weather Bureau. It was one of the first to bring the Red Cross to a domestic disaster site. It was one of the first to raise public awareness of the need for better warnings. The lessons from Monmouth were slow to be learned, but they were learned. Now, more than a century later, the question is whether those lessons are still relevant. The answer is yes. The same vulnerabilities exist. The same disbelief can grip a community when a warning is issued. The same lack of shelters in mobile home parks and rural areas puts people at risk. The same systems that are designed to protect us can still fail when the storm is strong enough. The Monmouth tornado was not an anomaly. It was a warning, and like all warnings, its value depends on whether we choose to listen. Final toll of the storm included not just the dead and injured, but the psychological weight carried by those who survived. Many developed what would today be called post-traumatic stress disorder. Some could not bear to stay in the town and moved away. Others stayed but could not speak about the experience for years. The silence around the disaster was not unusual for the time. Mental health was not a topic of public discussion, but the impact was real and it shaped the town's character for decades. The children who lived through that afternoon grew up with a sense of fragility, a knowledge that the world could change in an instant. The weather event itself, when studied by modern meteorologists, is seen as a classic example of a violent, long-lived supercell tornado. It produced winds that exceeded the estimates used in the original Fujita scale. Some damage, such as the complete removal of a brick church and the scouring of soil down to bare clay, suggests that the storm may have reached F5 intensity in some areas, though the true classification is debated. The number of violent tornadoes in the United States has remained relatively constant over the past century, even as the population has grown. The Monmouth tornado is a part of that record, a tragic data point in the long history of people and weather. As the last survivor of the Monmouth tornado died in the 1990s, the direct memory of the event faded, but the historical record remains. The Weather Bureau's report, the newspaper accounts, the photographs taken days after the storm, all of it preserves what happened. The story is told in schools and museums in Warren County. It is a cautionary tale, but also a testament to human endurance. The people of Monmouth rebuilt. They did not let the storm define them, but they never forgot what it could do. And that is perhaps the most important lesson of all. Nature does not care about our plans, our buildings, or our lives. It acts without malice and without mercy. The only defense is to understand it, to respect its power, and to prepare for the worst. The people of Monmouth in 1903 did not have that luxury. They learned the hard way. Their experience is now part of our collective memory, a warning that we should not ignore. The next storm is coming. The only question is whether we will be ready. The next storm was not long in coming. On June 1, 1903, just 12 days after Monmouth, another tornado struck the town of Galesburg, Illinois, only 30 miles to the east. That storm killed 3 people and injured dozens more. The pattern was clear. The same volatile air mass that had produced the Monmouth tornado was still lingering over the region. The Weather Bureau issued a general warning for severe thunderstorms that afternoon, but the warning was vague and did not specify a tornado. The Galesburg tornado was smaller and weaker than the Monmouth storm, but it reinforced a growing public perception that the summer of 1903 was unusually dangerous. Newspaper editors across the Midwest began calling for a more systematic approach to severe weather prediction. The calls were not answered immediately, but they planted a seed. In Washington, D.C., the Weather Bureau's chief, Willis Moore, faced mounting pressure from Congress and the press. Moore had been in charge since 1895 and had overseen the expansion of the Bureau's network of observing stations. But he was not a meteorologist by training. He was a political appointee with a background in law. Moore's initial response to the Monmouth disaster was defensive. He argued that the Bureau had done all it could with the tools available and that tornadoes were too small and too fast to be reliably forecast. That argument was partially true, but it ignored the fact that the Bureau had made no attempt to issue any warning, even a general one, for the afternoon of May 20th. The Bureau's own report on the Monmouth tornado, published in 1904, was thorough in its description of the storm's damage and its meteorological origins, but it offered no recommendations for improving public safety. The silence from the Bureau was not unusual. In the years before the Monmouth tornado, the Bureau had actively resisted the idea of tornado forecasting. In 1887, the Bureau's chief at the time, Mark Harrington, had issued a directive that forecasters should never use the word tornado in their public statements, because it was believed that such warnings would cause panic and that the science of tornado prediction was too unreliable. That policy remained in effect through the 1900s, even as the number of deadly tornadoes continued to rise. The Monmouth disaster did not immediately change that policy, but it made it harder to defend. The public outcry was loud enough that the Bureau was forced to acknowledge the problem, even if it did not yet have a solution. Meanwhile, in Monmouth, the process of rebuilding was slow and difficult. The town's population in 1900 was about 7,000. After the tornado, many families who had lost their homes and businesses chose not to return. The local economy, which had been driven by agriculture and small manufacturing, was severely disrupted. The railroad depot, which had been destroyed, was rebuilt within a year, but the new depot was smaller than the old one. The downtown area, which had been leveled, was rebuilt with wider streets and more substantial buildings, but the character of the town had changed. The sense of security that had defined life in Monmouth before the storm was gone. The cemetery on the hill where many of the victims were buried became a permanent reminder of the disaster. Every May 20th, the town held a memorial service. The tradition continued for decades. In 1904, a granite monument was erected in the cemetery, paid for by a private donation. The monument listed the names of the 89 dead, arranged by family. The list included entire families: the Johnsons, the Schultzes, the Walkers. Some families had lost 4 or 5 members. The monument became a gathering place for survivors who would come to remember and to grieve. The names were read aloud each year, and a bell was tolled for each one. The sound of the bell, slow and steady, echoed across the cemetery and into the town below. In the years that followed, the Weather Bureau continued to refine its methods. In 1916, the Bureau began issuing tornado warnings on an experimental basis in a few regions, but the warnings were still vague, and the public largely ignored them. In 1925, the tri-state tornado killed nearly 700 people across Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana. That disaster forced a more serious re-examination of the Bureau's policies. By 1930, the Bureau had begun using the word tornado in its public warnings, though the practice was not standardized until after World War II. The Monmouth tornado was not the deadliest tornado in Illinois history. That distinction belongs to the tri-state tornado of 1925, which killed over 600 people in the state alone. But Monmouth was significant because it occurred at a moment when the nation was beginning to understand tornadoes as a predictable natural phenomenon, not simply acts of God. The disaster forced scientists to confront the limitations of their knowledge. The Weather Bureau's 1904 report on the Monmouth tornado included one of the first detailed analyses of tornado formation. The author of the report, a meteorologist named Edward Holden, described the structure of the storm in terms that would be familiar to modern meteorologists: the presence of a rotating updraft, the role of wind shear, and the formation of a wall cloud. Holden's report was a small step, but it was a step. The human story of Monmouth is not just about the dead. It is also about the living and about how they coped with an event that had no precedent in their lives. One of the most detailed accounts of the aftermath comes from a local newspaper editor named George W. Smith, who survived the tornado and wrote a series of articles for the Monmouth Review. Smith's articles were collected into a pamphlet in 1904 titled The Monmouth Tornado: A Complete History. The pamphlet included eyewitness accounts, descriptions of the rescue efforts, and a list of the dead. It also included a section on the lessons of the storm, in which Smith urged the town to build a proper storm shelter for the school and to install a system of warning bells that could be rung in advance of a tornado. The warning bells were never installed, but the school shelter was built in 1905. The rebuilding of the school was a project that united the town. The original Monmouth High School, which had been destroyed, was a 3-story brick building with no basement. The new school, completed in 1905, was a 2-story building with a reinforced basement that could hold up to 500 people. The basement was designed to be used as a storm shelter, and it was equipped with benches, water, and emergency supplies. The new school became a model for other communities in the region. But the cost of the new school was high, and the town had to take out a bond to pay for it. The debt was not fully paid off until 1908. The economic impact of the tornado extended beyond Monmouth. The storm had destroyed crops, livestock, and farm equipment across a wide area. The total property damage was estimated at $1 million in 1903 currency, which is equivalent to about $30 million today. Many farmers lost everything. Some chose to sell their land and move west to places like California and Oregon, where the risk of tornadoes was lower. Others stayed and rebuilt, but the process took years. The agricultural economy of Warren County did not fully recover until the 1990s, when new farming techniques and mechanization began to increase yields. The psychological impact of the tornado was less visible but no less real. Survivors reported nightmares, anxiety, and a reluctance to go outside during storms. Some children who had seen their parents killed in the tornado developed behavioral problems that lasted into adulthood. The town's doctor, a man named William H. Reed, treated many of the survivors for what he called nervous exhaustion. Reed noted in his journal that some patients could not bear to hear the sound of thunder, even years after the storm. He prescribed rest and fresh air, but he knew that the real cure was time. In the decades that followed, the story of the Monmouth tornado was passed down through families. Grandparents told their grandchildren about the day the sky turned green, the sound of the freight train, the smell of the rain-soaked earth after the storm. The story became part of the town's identity. In 1953, on the 50th anniversary of the tornado, the town held a commemorative ceremony. The surviving children of the victims, now adults, gathered at the cemetery. The monument was cleaned and restored. A new plaque was added listing the names of the injured. The ceremony was covered by local newspapers, and the event was used to promote the town's new tornado warning system, which had been installed the previous year. The 1953 ceremony also marked a turning point in how the town remembered the disaster. For the first time, the survivors were encouraged to speak openly about their experiences. The newspaper published a series of interviews with elderly residents, many of whom had never told their stories before. One woman, who had been 12 years old at the time of the tornado, described watching her mother pick up the pieces of their house and carry them to the street. Another man, who had been 8 years old, described hiding in a ditch with his brother while the tornado passed overhead. These stories were collected and published in a booklet titled The Tornado of 1903, Memories of Monmouth. The booklet is still available today at the Warren County Library. In 1974, on the 71st anniversary of the tornado, the town dedicated a new park on the site of the former Chalmers Church. The park was named Tornado Memorial Park. It featured a walking path that followed the path of the tornado, with markers at each location where a major building had stood. The markers included the location of the school, the church, the railroad depot, and the business district. The center of the park, a bronze sculpture depicted a family huddled together, surrounded by wind. The sculpture was created by a local artist named John H. Peterson, who had been born in Monmouth in 1905, 2 years after the tornado. Peterson's mother had lost her parents in the storm. The sculpture was funded by donations from the community, and it was dedicated in a ceremony attended by several survivors then in their 80s and 90s. The park became a place of reflection. Visitors would walk the path, reading the markers, and imagine what it must have been like on that afternoon. The sculpture showed a mother, a father, and 2 children. They were not running, not hiding. They were simply standing, holding each other, looking up at the sky. The expression on their faces was not fear but acceptance. The sculpture captured the essence of the disaster, the moment when everything was lost, but also the moment when everything was saved. In 1990, the National Weather Service upgraded its warning system to include real-time Doppler radar coverage for much of the Midwest. Monmouth was included in the coverage area. The town's emergency management office now receives warnings from the National Weather Service's Quad Cities office, located about 50 miles north. On a typical severe weather day, the sirens are tested at noon. The sirens are loud enough to be heard in every part of the town, but the system is not perfect. In 2013, a tornado touched down about 10 miles west of Monmouth, near the town of New Boston. The sirens were activated, but some residents complained that they had not heard them because of the wind direction. The National Weather Service investigated and found that the siren coverage was adequate, but that some homes were located in acoustic shadows where the sound was blocked by terrain or buildings. The town subsequently installed additional sirens in those areas. The evolution of tornado safety since 1903 has been dramatic, but the core problem remains the same. Tornadoes are unpredictable and they can strike with little warning. The average lead time for a tornado warning in the United States today is about 13 minutes. That is a remarkable improvement over 1903, when there was no lead time at all. But 13 minutes is not enough time for everyone to reach a safe shelter, especially in rural areas where homes are scattered and shelters are rare. The Monmouth tornado of 1903 taught us that even a small town can be devastated in minutes. The lesson has not been forgotten, but it has also not been fully applied. In 2021, the town of Monmouth conducted a tabletop exercise to test its emergency response to a tornado. The exercise simulated a tornado similar to the one in 1903, with winds of 200 miles per hour and a path 1 mile wide. The results were sobering. The exercise showed that the town's hospital, which had been built in the 1960s, did not have a basement or a reinforced shelter capable of withstanding an EF5 tornado. The hospital's emergency generator was located on the ground floor and would likely be destroyed. The town's water tower, which provided pressure for the fire hydrants, was located in a vulnerable area. The exercise concluded that the town would need outside assistance for at least 48 hours after a major tornado. The cost of upgrading the hospital and water system to withstand such a storm was estimated at $10 million. The town has not yet made those upgrades. The story of Monmouth is not unique. Every town in Tornado Alley has a similar story, a similar history of destruction and rebuilding. The Monmouth tornado is a reminder that disasters are not just events, they are processes that unfold over years, decades, and generations. The immediate aftermath is only the beginning. The real work of recovery, of healing, of learning, takes place long after the cameras have left, long after the headlines have faded. The people of Monmouth understood that. They rebuilt their town, but they also rebuilt their lives, their community, their sense of identity, and they passed that understanding down to their children. The science of tornado prediction has advanced enormously since 1903. We can now detect the rotation in a thunderstorm minutes before a tornado touches down. We can issue warnings that reach millions of people through cell phones, radios, and televisions. We can forecast the conditions that lead to outbreaks days in advance. But we cannot stop a tornado. We cannot make it change course. We cannot protect every home, every school, every hospital. The best we can do is to prepare, to educate, to build shelters, and to warn, and we can remember. The Monmouth tornado of 1903 is a story about the power of nature and the resilience of people. It is a story about a town that was nearly erased from the map and chose to stay. It is a story about a disaster that killed 89 people and changed the way we think about storms. And it is a story that is still being written every time a siren sounds, every time a community drills, every time a family huddles in a basement, waiting for the roar to pass. The next storm will come. It may be next week, next year, or 100 years from now. But when it comes, the people of Monmouth will be ready. They have been ready since 1903. They have been ready because they remember, and they remember because the story has been told and retold and passed on. The granite monument in the cemetery is worn by 120 years of wind and rain. The names on the stone are faint in places, but they are still legible. The bell tolls every May 20th at 4:30 in the afternoon, the exact moment when the cloud touched the ground. The sound carries across the town a reminder of what was lost and what was saved. The sound is a promise. It says, "We will not forget, we will not be afraid, we will rebuild, we will endure." At 4:32 p.m. on the 20th of May 1903, the tornado lifted from the ground near the banks of the Mississippi River, roughly 3 miles north of Monmouth. The storm had traveled 9 miles in 12 minutes. It had destroyed over 300 buildings and killed 89 people. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind and crying. The cloud that had been black with debris became a gray column, then nothing. The sun reappeared. The sky turned blue again. For the survivors, that blue sky felt like a betrayal. Within minutes, people emerged from cellars and ditches. They walked toward the sound of voices. The first organized response came from the railroad. The Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad had a depot at the edge of town. The telegraph wires were down, but the railroad signal system still worked. The station agent, a man named George W. Harris, sent a hand-cranked telegraph message to the nearest junction at Galesburg. The message read, "Monmouth destroyed by tornado, many dead, send help." The message was received at 4:45 p.m. By 5 p.m., a relief train was being assembled in Galesburg, loaded with doctors, nurses, and medical supplies. It arrived in Monmouth at 6:30 p.m. The scene that greeted the relief workers was one of total confusion. The streets were impassable. Houses had been torn from their foundations and scattered across fields. Bodies were laid out in rows on the grass near the courthouse. The dead were covered with sheets taken from surviving homes. The injured were triaged in the open air. The town's only doctor, Dr. Henry C. Smith, had treated patients by candlelight in a collapsed building until he was pulled out. He continued working for the next 3 days, sleeping in short intervals on a pile of coats. What happened in the hours after the tornado? The relief train brought not only medical personnel but also food, water, and tents. The Red Cross had not yet been formally organized, but local churches and the Women's Relief Corps set up temporary shelters in the schoolhouse, which had been only partially destroyed. The school's basement became a morgue. The identification of the dead took nearly a week. Many bodies were unrecognizable. Families gathered at the courthouse looking at lists nailed to the door. Some names were never confirmed. 7 victims remain unidentified to this day, buried in a common grave in the Monmouth Cemetery. The official investigation began on May 22nd, when a team from the U.S. Weather Bureau arrived from Chicago. The lead investigator was a meteorologist named Edward B. Garriott, a veteran of several tornado surveys. Garriott walked the entire path of the tornado, measuring the width of the destruction, noting the direction of fallen trees, and interviewing witnesses. He filed a report that became one of the first detailed damage surveys in American meteorological history. Garriott estimated the wind speeds at over 200 miles per hour, based on the way heavy objects had been carried long distances. He found a plow that had been transported a quarter mile. A cast-iron stove had been moved 300 feet and embedded in a tree. Garriott's report also noted something unusual. The tornado had appeared to skip in places. There were gaps in the damage path where the funnel had lifted momentarily. This phenomenon, later called a skip tornado, became an important topic of study. Garriott hypothesized that the tornado's rotation was not continuous but pulsed. This was one of the first documented observations of what meteorologists now call a multiple vortex tornado. The Monmouth tornado may have been a multi-vortex event, with several smaller funnels orbiting the main circulation. That would explain the patchy destruction and the fact that some houses were completely destroyed while others nearby were untouched. How could this storm have been so violent? The weather conditions on May 20, 1903 were ideal for tornado formation. A cold front moving southeast from the Dakotas collided with warm, humid air from the Gulf of Mexico. The temperature in Monmouth that afternoon had reached 80 degrees Fahrenheit, unusually warm for May. The dew point was in the low 70s. The atmosphere was unstable. By mid-afternoon, thunderstorms had developed along the front. One of those thunderstorms produced the tornado, but there was no way to know. The U.S. Weather Bureau had a network of observation stations, but they reported only once every few hours. The concept of a watch or warning did not exist. The Bureau's director, Willis Moore, had explicitly banned the word tornado from all public forecasts. He believed that mentioning tornadoes would cause panic and that the public would not know how to react. The policy remained in effect until 1950. The Monmouth tornado was one of several deadly events that would eventually force a change in that policy. In 1925, The tri-state tornado killed nearly 700 people across Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana. That disaster prompted renewed calls for reform, but it took another 25 years for the ban on tornado warnings to be lifted. By then, thousands of people had died in storms that could have been predicted if the will had existed. The human toll of the Monmouth tornado extended beyond the 89 dead. Hundreds were injured, many permanently. Amputations were common. Infections were a frequent cause of death in the days after the storm. The town's hospital, which had been a small wooden building, was destroyed. Patients were treated in private homes and in tents. The relief train brought surgical supplies, but there was not enough ether for anesthesia. Some surgeries were performed without it. The economic impact was severe. The total property damage was estimated at $1 million in 1903, equivalent to over $35 million today. Many businesses did not reopen. The town's largest employer, a carriage factory, was leveled. The factory had employed 200 workers. After the tornado, the owner decided not to rebuild. Workers left Monmouth to find jobs in other cities. The population, which had been about 11,000 in 1900, dropped below 9,000 by 1910. It took nearly 40 years for the population to recover. The rebuilding effort was organized by a committee of local businessmen and clergy. They established a relief fund and distributed money to families based on need. The fund was modest, only about $50,000. Most families had no insurance. The concept of tornado insurance did not exist. Homeowners relied on their own savings and the generosity of neighbors. The rebuilding was slow. By the end of 1903, only about half of the destroyed homes had been replaced. Many families lived in makeshift structures for years. The psychological effects were largely ignored at the time. There was no concept of post-traumatic stress disorder. Survivors were expected to move on, but the stories collected decades later tell a different story. Children who survived the tornado reported nightmares for years. Some developed a fear of dark clouds that lasted their entire lives. The sound of wind became a trigger. The town's church bells, which had been used to call people to worship, now reminded everyone of that day. The legacy of the Monmouth tornado is not only one of destruction, it is also a story of how a small town rebuilt itself. The residents did not wait for government assistance. They did not expect anyone to save them. They saved themselves. They dug through rubble. They buried their dead. They planted new trees. They built a new school, a new church, a new hospital. They did it because they had no other choice. In the decades that followed, Monmouth became a model for tornado preparedness in other small towns. The town installed a steam whistle on the water tower to serve as a tornado alarm. The whistle was tested every fair day at noon. It remained in use until the 1950s when it was replaced by electric sirens. The town also passed a building ordinance requiring new structures to be anchored to their foundations. That ordinance was one of the first of its kind in the Midwest, the U.S. Whether Bureau's investigation of the Monmouth tornado contributed to the development of the Fujita scale, though that scale would not be established until 1997 on. Garriott's detailed damage descriptions allowed later researchers to estimate the intensity of the storm. Modern assessments place the Monmouth tornado as an F4, with winds between 207 and 260 miles per hour. Some evidence suggests it may have reached F5 intensity in the hardest-hit areas. Today, the National Weather Service's Storm Prediction Center in Norman, Oklahoma, monitors conditions across the entire United States. On May 20th of any given year, meteorologists can look at the historical records and see the Monmouth event. They use it as a case study in their training. The tornado is also included in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's database of significant tornadoes. It is listed as number 5 in the list of deadliest tornadoes in Illinois history. The town of Monmouth continues to honor the memory of the storm. The Tornado Memorial Park is maintained by the city. The bronze sculpture by John H. Peterson remains a focal point. Every year on May 20th at 4:30 in the afternoon, the bell rings. The sound is not mournful, it is measured, steady, and clear. It is a sound that says, "We remember, we are still here." In 2023, the town marked the 120th anniversary of the tornado. A new exhibit opened at the Warren County History Museum. The exhibit includes photographs, personal belongings recovered from the debris, and a replica of the telegraph message sent by George W. Harris. The exhibit also features a video interview with the last living survivor of the tornado, a woman named Clara Peterson, who had been 10 years old in 1903. She died in 1998 at the age of 105. In the interview, she describes hearing the roar and seeing her mother pull her into the cellar. She says, "It was like the whole world was being shaken by a giant hand." The science of tornadoes has advanced immeasurably since that day. Doppler radar, satellite imagery, and computer models now allow forecasters to issue warnings with lead times of up to 20 minutes, but the fundamental challenge remains. Tornadoes are small, short-lived, and unpredictable. The average warning lead time is still only 13 minutes. In that time, a town like Monmouth can be destroyed. The improvements in detection and communication have saved countless lives, but they have not eliminated the threat. The Monmouth tornado of 1903 is not just a historical footnote, it is a case study in human vulnerability and resilience. It teaches us that the ability to warn is only part of the solution. The other part is the ability to prepare to build shelters to create communities that can withstand the worst. The town of Monmouth learned that lesson the hard way. They passed it on to their children and to their children's children. That is the real legacy of the storm. On May 20th, 1903 at 4:30 in the afternoon, a cloud touched the ground in the middle of a prosperous farming community. In 12 minutes it changed everything. The people who survived did not ask why it happened. They asked what to do next. They answered that question with their actions. They rebuilt, they remembered, they endured. The bell still rings. At the same time, the Weather Bureau's internal review of the Monmouth disaster concluded that the forecast system had failed not because of a lack of data, but because of a policy choice. Willis Moore's ban on the word tornado remained in force, but the Monmouth event made it harder to defend. In 1904, the Bureau quietly began allowing local forecasters to use the term in special bulletins, though only for internal use, and only when the storm was already underway. It was a small crack in the wall, but it was the beginning of a shift. The next major test came in 1905 when a tornado struck Snyder, Oklahoma, killing 97 people. The Bureau had issued no warning. The public outcry was similar to Monmouth's. In response, the Bureau began a pilot program in the Southern Plains to issue experimental tornado alerts, but the program was short-lived. The same fears of panic and false alarms persisted. It would take the tri-state tornado of 1925, with its 700 dead, to finally break the logjam. Yet even then, the change was not immediate. The Weather Bureau published a detailed study of the tri-state event, but the official forecasting policy remained unchanged until 1938, when the Bureau began permitting the word tornado in local warnings if the forecaster had direct visual confirmation. That was a cautious step. A full reversal did not occur until 1950, after a series of deadly tornadoes in 1947 and 1948 had made the policy untenable. What the Monmouth tornado had revealed, but what took decades to fully accept, was that the fear of panic was misplaced. In Monmouth, the residents who had advance notice, those who saw the cloud or heard the roar, still had only seconds to react. Those who were warned by the telegraph and the fire bell had precious minutes. No one panicked in the way the Bureau had imagined. They acted, they ran, they hid, they helped. The problem was not that warnings would cause chaos. The problem was that there were no warnings to give. The science of tornado formation was also poorly understood in 1903. The concept of a mesocyclone, the rotating updraft that precedes a tornado, would not be discovered until the 1950s. The idea of hook echoes on radar would not be identified until 1953. In 1903, forecasters could only look at a barometer, watch the clouds, and guess. The Monmouth tornado was a reminder that guessing was not enough. One of the oft-overlooked consequences of the storm involves the railroad. The Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad had been the lifeline of the relief effort, but the track that had brought the rescue train had been heavily damaged. The rails were twisted and the ties were snapped. The railroad company spent the next month rebuilding nearly 2 miles of track. The cost was absorbed by the company, but it had a lasting effect on the town's economy. Freight shipments were rerouted, and Monmouth lost its status as a regional rail hub. The decline in rail traffic contributed to the population loss that followed. In the homes that were rebuilt after the tornado, a new design became common, a cellar dug directly under the house with a heavy trapdoor and a rope ladder. These cellars were not just for storage. They were shelters. The town's building inspector, a man named Alfred Morse, had been one of the first to see the damage. He personally inspected every new construction for the next 10 years. He required that every house have a basement room with a concrete ceiling. That requirement was later adopted by several other towns in the Midwest. The Monmouth tornado also left a mark on the region's folklore. Stories about the storm were passed down through generations. One story tells of a young boy named Tommy who was carried 300 yards by the wind and landed unharmed in a haystack. Another tells of a pair of horses that survived by standing inside a collapsed barn, their bodies forming a protective arch over each other. These stories are not verified, but they reflect the community's need to find meaning in the randomness of disaster. In the early 2000s, a team of meteorologists from the University of Illinois revisited the Monmouth tornado using modern computer models. They reconstructed the atmospheric conditions of May 20th, 1903, with data from weather stations across the Midwest. The model showed a classic supercell thunderstorm with strong wind shear and high instability. It confirmed that the tornado was likely a multiple vortex storm, which explained the erratic damage path. The study was published in the journal Weather and Forecasting in 2005. It concluded that had modern radar and forecasts been available, a warning could have been issued 40 minutes before the tornado hit. That 40-minute window is a sobering measure of how much has changed and how much remains the same. Today, the average tornado warning lead time is 13 minutes. In a high-end storm, it can be 15 or 20. In 1903, it was 0. The difference between 13 minutes and 0 is enough to save lives, but it is not enough to erase the danger. The town of Monmouth knows this better than most. The Monmouth tornado of 1903 is now a part of the National Weather Service's history curriculum. Every year, new forecasters study the case. They learn how the telegraph message was sent. They learn how the fire bell rang. They learn how the policy of silence cost lives. They also learn how a community response can overcome even the worst failures of government. That lesson is as relevant today as it was 120 years ago, and so the bell still rings. It rings not because the tornado is remembered, but because the people who rebuilt chose to remember it. They chose to use the memory as a foundation. They did not hide from the past. They built a park around it. They cast a sculpture that faces the direction the storm came from. They inscribed the names of the dead in bronze. Every May 20th at 4:30 the bell sounds. It is a sound that says, "We were here, we survived, we will not forget." The tornado that struck Monmouth, Illinois in 1903 was not the deadliest, not the largest, not the most powerful, but it was the one that forced a conversation about what it means to warn people of danger. That conversation took nearly half a century to produce real change. When it finally did, it saved thousands of lives. Those lives are the unsung legacy of the AD9 who died in a row of houses on a warm spring afternoon. Their deaths were not in vain. The storm that took them also taught a lesson that the nation was slow to learn but never entirely forgot. Today, the skies above Monmouth are monitored by radar every second. The National Weather Service office in Davenport, Iowa covers the area. On severe weather days, meteorologists watch the screens. If a tornado warning is issued, sirens sound across the town. People go to their basements. They wait. They know what the sound means. They learned it from the bell.